In this video, we're going to introduce the concept of server components in React, and you're going to learn everything that you need to know to be able to start using them in your own applications. We're going to go over and learn about server components and how they work, the differences between them and client components, talk about when you should use which, and more importantly, how to combine them together, and finally, go over some of the benefits and drawbacks of using server components as opposed to client components. And also, by the way, before we start, if you want to learn React by building a real-world project, check out Project React. It'll be the first link in the description. Alright, so server components. Let's talk about them. Now, probably you've already heard about server components and what they are from Next.js. Last year, Next.js made a pretty big update when they launched the new app router that also introduced support for server components. Now, contrary to what it might seem, server components are not specifically a Next.js feature. They're actually a React feature. Next.js just happened to be the first ones to properly implement them. Now, this made quite the big news in the development community because server components are fundamentally different to how client components work and how we were building with React all of this time. Traditionally, React applications were mostly on the client. This meant that to have an application running, the browser would have to download a JavaScript bundle that contains all of the code for the application to be able to run. Server components, on the other hand, change that completely. They literally add a new dimension to React and allow React to run on the server without necessarily being sent to the client. This is a fundamental shift in the way that React works at its core and how we use it to build applications. So it's very important that you watch this video and that you watch it carefully and until the end, because this will teach you how to be ready for the future of React. So here I have a Next.js application that I'm going to use to show you how server components work. We're going to be using Next.js because it currently, at the time of recording this video, has the best and most stable implementation of server components compared to other frameworks. It's also the easiest to set up. Now here we have a component server page, and this looks like a normal React component. The only difference is that this is a server component. And the reason why we know that this is a server component is because we are in Next.js, and in Next.js, all components by default, if you're using the app router, are server components unless explicitly marked otherwise, which we haven't done. Now this component is a normal JavaScript function, exactly as you would expect from a normal traditional React component, and it also renders some JSX over here. We have a main tag and then an h1 tag that says this runs on the server. If we open up the application, this is the component right here, and we see that this runs on the server is painted on our browser, and this component works exactly as you would expect. I can add a period here, and then let's add a period here, and then I can go back, and this is reflected in the UI. Again, no surprises here. This works exactly as we're used to. But make no mistake, this has a fundamental difference than what we are used to. Although this runs and shows up on the browser, the actual code that generated this HTML for the browser ran on the server. And to really illustrate that to you, let's now come back to our component and let's add some JavaScript into it. So let's come here and let's add a simple console log in this component to track when this component gets rendered. So we're going to do console.log, and then we're going to put rendered like this. Now, if we go back to the application and we open up the browser console, and I can just refresh over here, we're not seeing any logs in the console. We're not seeing console log rendered in the console anywhere. We're not seeing it because this is a server component. It does not run on the client. It does not run in the browser. So how does this actually work? How does a server component work? Well, the server component has two parts. It has all of the code inside of this return block over here, the JSX that gets converted into actual HTML. And it also has all of the code here in the body of the component that is used to render that final HTML. In the case of a server component, all of this code over here actually runs on the server and then is used to compute the final HTML inside of here, right? This main tag, all of it gets converted to HTML using this code as you would in a normal component. And then that final HTML is the only thing that is sent to the client, but it's sent as HTML, not as JavaScript. So this console log over here never actually makes it to the client. It only runs on the server when this component gets executed. It then computes the final HTML, which has all of this over here. And then this is what gets actually sent to the client and what shows up on the browser over here. That's why we're saying that this runs on the server, because the code that was used to generate this HTML only ran on the server. And in our case, the server is actually here. If I open up the terminal, this is the VSCode terminal that is running the actual Next.js application. You can see over here, we have rendered, right? These are the console logs. This doesn't log in the browser. This logs in the server in the process that is actually running the React application. And that is very important to understand because this is a fundamental difference to how a client component is going to work. In the case of a client component, this code would run on the browser. You would see this in the console log. If you open up Chrome and inspect the console, you will see this log over there. And then all of this code that is required to actually render this JSX into HTML also runs on the browser, on the client. Everything runs there. But in the case of a server component, it doesn't, and only the actual final HTML that is computed from that code is getting sent to the actual client. To really see and understand how this works, let's look at more examples of the differences between server components and client components. So here, if I go to the sidebar, I have another component. This one is a client component. And the reason that we know that this is a client component is because here at the top, we have use client. This is how in Next.js, you define a client component. You put use client at the top, and then this will mark this file and everything that it uses as a client component. So then we have the same component over here. It's called client page. And this one renders the same JSX, except that it says this runs on the client. And this is just going to be a normal client component as you're used to in React by now. If we open up our browser again and we go here to /client, we can see that we have the client component and we have this runs on the client. We can even come here and add console.log rendered, and then we can see that this renders in our console because this is a client component, and again all of that code happens on the client inside of the browser. Now let's say that we wanted to have a button here with an on-click event handler, right? So we can come here, we can actually remove this rendered here, we can do button, and then we can do click here for the name and just do something on click, and then we can pass it a function that will simply do console.log and then clicked like this. If we now go back to the application and refresh, we can click this button and we have clicked log in the console. This works exactly as we expect. But now if you come here to the server component and try to do the exact same thing, so I'm going to take this button over here and just paste it in the server. Now, if we come here back to our application and go back to server, we're going to see that this doesn't work. We actually have an error and we have event handlers cannot be passed to client component props. In server components, you cannot have on-click event handlers or any other event handler for that matter. And just take a second to really think about why you can't do that. In a server component, you're running all of this code on the server, and only the final HTML is what gets sent to the client. So in that case, a client cannot click a button because the code that is creating this button is not on the client. There's nothing to click. Everything is happening on the server, and once that is done, then we get the button sent. But this on-click event handler here does not belong in a server component because this runs on the server, not on the client. And because of this, you can't use on click, you can't use on drag mouse over, you can't use on focus, on blur, you can't use any of the traditional event handlers because they do not work on the server. They only work on the client. And for the same reason, this also means that you cannot use any hooks either in a server component. So you can't do something like use state like this. You cannot do this in a server component because this won't work. If I try to import this directly from React and save and then go back here to the browser, we have a different error, and it's saying here that you're importing a component that needs use state. It only works in a client component, but none of its parents are marked with use client. So they're server components by default. You cannot use state because the concept of state, the concept of something dynamically changing, of a render cycle, right, which we have in React, does not exist on the server because on the server, all of this code is only executed once to generate the final HTML and then sent to the browser, and that's it. The component goes away. It doesn't live to be able to have an update or to be able to hold state. You also can't use effect, right? This doesn't work because there is no render cycle in this component, so there's nothing to trigger when the component mounts, when the component updates or unmounts. These things don't work. If you want to have hooks, if you want to have interactivity, because all of these things really come for our interactivity, you have to put them in a client component, just like this error is telling you. It only works in a client component, but none of its parents are marked with use client. Use client, once again, is how you define a component to be a client component. Since we don't have this is a server component, and all of these interactive things just do not work. Now, because of this, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what's the benefit of using server components? Aren't we being limited by the fact that we can't have on-click event handlers, we can't have any hooks, we can't do all of this stuff that we're traditionally used to doing with React? What's the point of server components? Well, yes, it's true that when you're using a server component as opposed to a client component, you do lose all of this functionality. You lose access to the hooks, to any event handlers, and any interactivity, which can feel limiting because it is, you don't have access to these things. But the question that I would ask is, do you even need to have interactivity everywhere in every component in your application? Probably not. And let me show you with an example. So let's first get rid of all of this code over here and just make it fresh. So we have no button, we have nothing. We're back to how we were initially at the start of the video. Let's take the common example of data fetching, right? Data fetching is something that is very common in most React applications. You're going to have to fetch data from somewhere and display it in your application. Now, to fetch data in a traditional React client component, here if I can just remove this, what you would have to do is you would first have to do something like use state, right? Have a state for your data. So for example, data, and then set data like this, and then we'll have to import use state from React, and then we might have a use effect, for example, use effect that would fetch the actual data. So we can do something like this, and then we can just import this as well. Obviously, this is accounting for the fact that you're not using React Query, but even if you're using React Query, this is what React Query does behind the scenes, so the concept still applies. Now, this is the way that we're all used to actually fetching data in React, right? You have a piece of state for your data, and then you're fetching the data. And once you actually have the data, you're just setting it and updating that piece of state. And that is going to cause the component to re-render. And then your data is actually displayed on the screen. Now, this works fine, but this is actually not the most efficient way to do things. First of all, you have to keep track of this state and you have to manage it. Then you have to keep track of a use effect and its dependency. And we all know how complicated this dependency array can be. And then you have to go in here and actually update all the things that you have to update. And then if you want a loading state, if you want an error state, you also have to do all of these things here and manage them yourself. Not only that, but all of this code can only run after the JavaScript bundle has been downloaded by the user on the client in their actual browser. So you have to first wait for that to happen. Then you have to actually run this component without any data. So this data is going to be undefined initially. Then you have to fetch the data. You have to wait for the data to actually show up. And then you might show a loading spinner while that happens. And then you have to update the component, cause a re-render to actually show the data. That's a lot of steps, and this takes a lot of time. However, in a server component, this looks a lot different. So first of all, because this runs on the server, we actually get another benefit, which is that we can make this an asynchronous function. So we can do async like this and convert this component into an asynchronous function. This works because this is a server component. This wouldn't work in a client component. And then because this is now an asynchronous function, this means that we can actually do asynchronous stuff in here, like fetch data from an API. So we can do something like const data, and then we can await, and then fetch the data and then set it in this state over here. This does exactly the same thing as we had in this client component. We have the same data, we're fetching the same data over here, but the only difference is that now we're doing it in one line of code. We have no state to manage, we have no use effect to manage, and more importantly, we have no updates to happen. We're just directly awaiting the result of this fetch, storing it in this data variable, and then we can directly use data inside of this component, and the final HTML from the data, from the fetch, along with everything else, is going to get built, compiled, and then sent to the browser to be able to show on the screen. This is a lot less code than doing the same thing in a client component, and is actually faster because this does not have to wait for the bundle to be downloaded. In this case, there is no bundle, right? We're not shipping any JavaScript, we're only shipping final HTML to the client. So we don't have to wait for any bundle to actually be downloaded, which means that this code can run faster. And then also we're not having to update anything and wait for something to fetch. We're just waiting for this to fetch, and then the data is immediately available to use in the component without having to trigger a re-render of the component. So yes, going back to the argument, in a server component, we can't use state, we can't use effects, but we actually don't need to use them. There's a simpler way to do it by just directly fetching the data, awaiting it, and then just using it in the component. Use effects and use state are a byproduct of having to use client components, which have to wait and have to be run exclusively on the client and have to wait for the bundle to be downloaded before they can actually execute their code. The only reason that we have to do all of this is because we are in a client component. Ideally, if you're in a server component, you skip all of that, you ditch all of that, and you just do it the simple way, which is, again, a lot simpler. And also there's another benefit. So let's go here in the actual Explorer, and I have here a expensive function file, which is just a function that obviously is not really expensive, but just imagine that this would be expensive, that this had tens of thousands of lines of code or like imported some other expensive libraries. And we wanted to use this function in both of these components. If you come here to the client component, and let's say we want to use it inside of this use effect over here, we can do expensive function and call it like so. Because we've put this function now inside of this use effect, inside of this component over here, and we've imported this function inside of this component, this function will now end up getting sent in the bundle that the user has to download on the client. And if this is an expensive function, if this is a lot of kilobytes of data, we're now putting all of that data, all of that constraint, all of that load on the user to download before we can even begin to actually load and run the code in this client component. But in the case of a server component, if we were to do the same thing, expensive function, and import it directly, we're still using the function here, just like we're using it in a client component. We're still importing the function, but because this runs entirely on the server, this expensive function actually never ever makes it to the actual client. There's nothing to download. The cost of the expensive function, of all of its resources, is borne by the server and not by the client. So your users will see the same final HTML that, yes, now accounts for the expensive function, but they are not the ones running that function. You are, the server is, which is more efficient. Now, I hope that you're able to understand by now that there's actually a lot of meaningful benefits to using server components as opposed to client components. Now, this doesn't mean that you should never use client components and that server components are the only thing that you have to implement from now on in your React application. That's not the goal of this video, and that's certainly not the goal of server components. Server components are not meant to replace client components, but to actually live alongside them. Because the truth is, in your React applications, you're going to want to have interactivity. You're going to want to have on-click event handlers. You're going to want to have on-change event handlers, and you're going to have to need to use useState or useEffect to actually trigger some updates in your components. You are, after all, building a React application, which is meant to be interactive. But the thing is, you're not going to need that interactivity in every single component in your application. There's going to be a lot of components that you don't need any interactivity, and you can convert all of those into server components for the better performance and actually shipping a smaller bundle to your client, to your users, to make the application feel faster and more performant. And the beauty of server components is that you can use them interchangeably with client components and actually get the best of both worlds. When you need to have performance and run your code on the server with less code, you use a server component. And when you need to have interactivity in your application, you create a client component and you put all of that interactive code in there. So let me now show you how to mix server and client components together. So let's come here to the server. Let's actually remove all of this code because we won't need it. We'll remove the import as well, and we can actually remove the data here as well. Now we can close this and we can close this as well. And here in the Explorer, I have a component here. I have a client component. This is an empty client component, and we know it's a client component because we're using useClient here at the top. To use this component inside of a server component, the only thing that we have to do is come here to the server component, and all that we have to do is just do client component and import it and place it directly in here. And this works. Now, the way that this works, and this is going to be partly specific to Next.js, is that first, initially, all of this code over here is going to get ran on the server initially once, right? Including this client component. So even though we put this as useClient here, Next.js is actually going to run all of this on the server once to generate the initial HTML to send to the user. But then, because we marked client component with useClient and it's now a client component, Next.js is actually going to rerun this component once more on the client, and this time it's going to add all of the JavaScript to make this component interactable. And this is what we call hydration. So in Next.js specifically, this works in two steps. The first step is that first everything gets run once on the server, including client components. This generates the final HTML that gets sent to the browser. And then every client component within it gets run a second time on the client to add all of the JavaScript in the process that we call hydration to make that component interactable. Right, so if you go here to the client component and we just put something client component in here, and then we save and go back to the application, we're seeing that we have one part that runs on the server and the other part that runs on the client in this two paths. Everything ran once on the server, and then this client component ran once again on the client to make it interactable. So this is how you put a client component in a server component. Now, what about the other way? What about putting a server component in a client component? Well, you could do that, but there's a little asterisk because you have to be careful. So here in the Explorer, I have another component, which is an empty component. This is a server component without useClient at the top. Let's now try to put server component inside of client component over here. So we can take all of this code and actually replace it with server component like so. Now we've taken the server component and we've put it inside of this client component, so this should work, right? Well, here's where you have to be careful, because this doesn't work and the server component is actually going to end up running on the client, even though we've marked it as a server component by not putting use client here at the top. So why does this happen? Well, it happens because of this use client over here. So this use client doesn't only apply to the current page of this component. When you use client here at the top, you're actually saying, and you're marking a boundary, and you're saying that this file and everything beyond is actually going to run on the client. It's a one-way direction and you can't go back. So what we're saying here is that we're saying that use client in this file, everything that runs in here, including these imports, should be run on the client, right? So the server component, even though it's a server component, it's being imported and used in a client component, it will now run exclusively on the client. And that's because of this use client over here. So once again, this does not only apply to this file. Think of it as a line, as a boundary, where you're saying that from here on now, everything else beyond this point is on the client and no longer on the server. You cannot have anything on the server past this point in this file. But now let me show you another way that you can achieve this and actually put this server component, have this server component be rendered on the server, but still show up inside of the body of this client component. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the import of the server component. We're going to remove this over here, and we're going to define some props for the client component. So we're going to do type client component props, and that is going to be children react.react node. And then we're going to come in here, we're going to do children, and we're going to do child component props like this. And we're going to paste here the children inside of this client component over here. So note, we haven't imported anything in this component. All we did is define some props over here and still put all of this inside of use client for a client component. Then if we go back here to our server page component where we're actually using the client component, now we have an error, which is saying that property children is missing because we defined children, but we haven't provided them. So let's change that. Let's come here and let's close this client component tag. And let me close it properly like so, and then over here. And now we can put in here, we can do server component and import this directly. So now what we did is we essentially have the same exact thing as we had it before. We have the server component and we put it inside of the body of this client component, but we did it through children. This means that the server component is no longer imported in a client component file, It's now imported over here, which is in a server environment. So the server component is going to run on the server, even though it's being used and plugged into a client component. So what we have here is we have a server component that's ran inside of a client component that's ran inside of a server component. You can do this, you can mix and match, but again, you have to follow the rules and you have to be careful with this use client boundary, because everything that you put in here is going to go on the client, and to avoid that, put it in a place where it's on the server and then pass it through children like we've done here. And I know that this might seem a little bit confusing, at least it was to me when I was first starting out working with server components, but trust me on this, if you spend enough time with it and you try to actually play around with it, when this clicks, you're going to realize that this makes a lot of sense and that this is actually a better approach to having everything on a client as we had it previously with React. Because now you're able to use this client boundary over here, you're able to use this and define exactly what runs on the server and what runs on the client. You have the freedom to actually decide what is most performant for your app and what makes the most sense. In this case, we have no interactive code over here. So all of this code should run on the server and it's going to be more performant for the actual user that's using our application. But then in this client component, let's say that we needed to have use state like this, or we need to have use effect like this. We would put all of this code inside of this file, inside of this client component. This would run as normal as expected in your traditional client React application, but without having to make everything in a server component, in a client component, sorry. So we can use server components for the benefits, get all of the performance, and then when we need interactivity, we create a client component and we actually put all of that interactivity in there and everything just works beautifully. This is a fundamental paradigm shift to how you use React components and where you define and how you build your application. So once again, it's very important that you wrap your head around this and try to play around with it to really understand how all of this works, because this is the future of React. And to help you with that, so that you can actually get some practice, because once again, I really think that this is important, all of the code that you've seen in this video is going to go inside of this repository and it's going to be linked in the description. So all of this code over here, obviously I'm going to clean this up and make it just a little bit pretty so that you can work with it, is going to be on the repository, which you should definitely clone, play around with it, and really get a feel for server components and how they work. Once again, this is important, and this is going to be the future of React. And also, if you're still here, if you're still watching this video, first of all, thank you so much. And second of all, this probably means that you're really interested in learning about React and learning how to work with React, which is great because I just launched Project React, which is a course where you learn React by building a real world project. I've literally poured my heart and soul into this course, and this takes everything that I've learned over the last 8 years of working with React, packages it in a course that's super easy to follow, and that literally walks you through step by step with instructions and code on how to build a big and complex application with React from A to Z. If you want to check it out, if you're interested, it's literally going to be the first link in the description. It's called Project React. This is the best thing that you can do for yourself. This is the best React course that you can take because this really is going to teach you everything that you need to know to be able to build a big and complex real world project with React. So once again, Project React, first link in the description. I'll see you on the other side. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos just like this one, make sure to leave this video a big thumbs up. You can also click here to subscribe, or you can click here to watch a different video of mine that YouTube seems to think that you're really going to enjoy. And with that being said, my name has been Darius Kozin. This is Kozin Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.